but ships owned by Massachusetts firms would move tens of thousands of slaves for profit. The most successful American slave traders had relationships in Europe. As the slave trade grew in Europe, the English port of Liverpool went from a fishing village to a first-rate seaport. 4 families dominated the trade. The wealthiest was Foster Cunliffe, who had 4 ships that sailed for Africa each year. His wealth grew from the trade, and he was elected mayor. The American headquarters of the Cunliffe trading business was at Oxford, Maryland, where Cunliffe's American agent was the father of Robert Morris, the chief financier of the American Revolution. Just as many American fortunes are founded on the slave trade, opium running, and smuggling, so are many of England's. The slave trade grew in leaps and bounds in Britain, and 2 cities, Bristol and Liverpool, became hotspots for the trade. Bristol had become an important seaport during the Crusades, and Templar ships controlled the industry there. When the slave trade exploded as an economic opportunity, Bristol's business increased, with her merchants responsible for the yearly transport of 70,000 slaves. Liverpool's history was shorter. It evolved into 208 from the sacred to the profane seaport as a result of the slave trade. Prior to Liverpool's entry into the trading business, its population numbered 5,000. After entering the cotton, sugar, and slave trade triangle, businesses such as shipbuilders, textile mills, and supporting industries enlarged the tiny port and its surrounding towns to nearly 1 million people. Prominent English families who controlled the trade included the Lelands, Ingrams, Cunliffes, Taylortons, Claytons, Bowles, Kenyons, and Bannisters. These families started the city's banks and industries, many of which survive today. Point 2 Not much was done to conceal the ugly business. Even the Liverpool City Exchange building depicted African heads and elephants. New England's first slave trading ship came from the seaport city of Marblehead, but it was built in Salem, and was registered there. The Desire did not pioneer the trade to Africa, but simply sailed to the West Indies, and returned with slaves for sale in Connecticut. Point 3 Marblehead and Salem were capitals of a sea trading empire that spanned the 7 seas. Those who took part in the trade were firmly connected by the Masonic Lodge system. In fact, a Marblehead lodge carried American masonry to China, where in the heyday of opium trading Massachusetts had a beachhead. The lodges of the Massachusetts seamen were rough and fraternal, and would admit ship owners and common laborers, but as the owners became wealthy, they often gravitated to more prestigious lodges. Within a generation or 2 they frequently moved to Boston. Colonial masonry rose above the divisive factors such as religion and color, but it reinforced the barrier between the rich and the poor. Point 4 Boston's first families soon entered the trade. Peter Fanuel, a mason and a Huguenot, was an active trader. He was joined by the Belchers, the Cabots, and the Waldos. While the customers of the slave trade were the southern plantations, the shippers were New Englanders. Modern Boston tries to downplay its role in the slave trade, with Massachusetts historians pointing the finger at its neighbor Rhode Island. Historian Samuel Morrison claims the Guinea trade had never been an important line of commerce in Massachusetts, quote 5 Yet at the same time he master masons, and their slaves 209 admits that Salem had a regular trade with Africa, selling rum and fish for gold dust, palm oil, and ivory. It would be surprising if the occasional shipmaster did not yield to the temptation, notes the author. Point 6 Morrison, who was from a prominent Brahmin family, equally warned readers against exaggerating the opium trafficking. Point 7 But there is no denying that the bedrock of New England's wealth, including that of many of today's most successful corporations, was funded with the proceeds of both the slave trade and the opium trade. Despite Massachusetts's claims to the contrary, it was involved in the trade almost as far back as Virginia was. Samuel Vassall, one of the colony's first promoters, is on record complaining about the monopoly of the Guinea Company, an English institution, in the lucrative trade in 1649. A 1724 letter from Irish merchant Thomas Samory suggests that the shippers of the slave trade were predominantly from New England. Other historians also conclude that the slave trade's contribution to the industry of New England is much greater than most will concede. The authors of New England and the Sea claim that 30% of the traffic in blacks was done on New England ships. Furthermore, the tobacco and rice plantations, fueled by slave labor, were the biggest customers for New England's exports. Timber, rum, and fish. As the authors put it, the coffers of some of New England's proudest families were filled with profits from this trade. 9 Massachusetts might have been the first New England state to get involved in the trade, but as it devoted its attention to China, the state's slavery business was soon eclipsed by that of its neighbor Rhode Island. Rhode Island and the trade. New Englanders like to claim the slave trade was centered in Rhode Island, and they are not completely incorrect in assigning the blame. 10 Rhode Islanders, in turn, like to point the finger at the Jews, which is also in part correct. In 1654 a handful of Portuguese Sephardic families fearing a new Inquisition left their country for the Netherlands. After a brief time they came to America. Rhode Island, founded by Roger 210 from the sacred to the profane Williams, offered religious freedom. It also offered something even more evolutionary to a small group of families: economic freedom. This handful of closely related families learned quickly and soon came to represent most of the slave trading business of the tiny colony. Sephardic families including those of Aaron Lopez, Abraham Redwood, Abraham Pereira Mendes, Jacob Riveras, Jacob Pollock, and the DeWolfs joined English colonists like William Ellery, Henry Collins, Samuel Vernon, John Canning, and Joseph Wanton, who also made money from the trade. The slave trade was not the province of Jews, Episcopalians, or Huguenots. It did, however, pay to band together and operate in secrecy. Christian or Jewish, the slave traders had to be connected, at least to each other. Religious affiliation was often the tie that bound. But not every slave trader was from a persecuted sect. For this reason it was very important to be accepted into a lodge. The lodge system, which was composed of the elite ship owners, made navigating the treacherous waters of both the Atlantic Ocean and New England political life easier. The Newport Lodge was founded by a merchant from Boston, and once it was established it was populated mostly by Jews from Portugal and the Caribbean. Moses Seixas served as Grand Master for Rhode Island from 1791 to 1800. He went on to become one of the founders of the Bank of Rhode Island. Intermarriage among Newport's first families tightened the bonds, as it did among the Boston merchant elite. But intermarriage did not mean marrying within one's race or religion. It meant marrying within one's caste. A Protestant could marry a Jew, as long as they were both from the same station in life. Ship owner, sea captain, and merchant were three titles within the higher caste of Rhode Island life. In America, Jews in general did not suffer the degree of hostility that they encountered in Europe. While in many countries Masonry rejected Jews, and at least one still does, in America Masonry welcomed them. Moses Michael Hay, a Portuguese Sephardic Jew, was instrumental in bringing Scottish Rite Masonry to America, and Paul Revere, a Huguenot, was his deputy Grand Master. Hay was also instrumental in founding the Bank of Boston. Master Masons and their slaves 211. Not all of the men who were instrumental in fomenting rebellion were Masons. Sam Adams, for example, used the taverns where lodges met as a means of getting mob support. He was very much against the slave trade, and refused the gift of a slave. John Adams, too, declared that any slave who entered his house was a free man. He was against the trade, and was an outspoken critic of Masonry. The cronyism it bred allowed many to be above the law. Among Rhode Island's Jewish merchants, Aaron Lopez was possibly the most famous, with 30 ships to his credit. After fleeing a new wave of inquisitorial zeal in Portugal, Lopez arrived in Newport in the 1750s with a second group of Sephardic Jews. He made contacts rapidly in Boston, Charleston, New York, and Jamaica, and began trading rum, furniture, candles, and slaves. In 1775 he was the single biggest taxpayer in the state, and had an estate in British Antigua as well.